Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Ethics Lecture. This is the third in a series of 4, and I'm John Hooper. I'm Vice President of the UU Fellowship at Chautauqua and coordinator of the brand new humanist community at Chautauqua. And it's really my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, J.D. Stillwater, a close friend of mine. I don't know if any of you know Ursula Goodenough, the religious naturalist who wrote a book called Sacred Depths of Nature. Well, I'd say that J.D. and I are sort of Ursula Goodenough groupies, and we're really kind of committed to helping her establish something called the Religious Naturalist Association. And J.D. is working on an affiliate group of that called the Religious Naturalist UUs. So it's kind of RNUU, so it's renew, if you remember. And if you're interested, you can now look up the website for RNA and get involved in that. J.D. is a graduate of Cornell University and is kind of a science ambassador. He spends his time, he's very peripatetic. We thought he'd come here to Chautauqua with his wife Ann and have a little bit of a rest, but it looks like he's working here as well. They'll be here for a few days, so if you see them, say hello. He speaks with really a lot of knowledge and energy around the role of science, particularly in how it relates to environmental and climate change issues. So I don't want to spend a lot of time introducing. He's also on the governing council of the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, IRIS, which is a conference every year in Star Island. And as I say, he's an officer in the Religious Naturalist Association. So without any further ado, J.D. Stillwater.
Good morning. What a beautiful space this is. Makes me want to go, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join together. Sorry, wrong day. Well, all kidding aside, I am serious about uniting the world's various religions around a common scripture. And I'm not talking about a book you can hold in your hands. So the theme of this week's talks is spiritually grounding and inclusively affirming. So with that in mind, I want to start with a true story. My spouse Ann and I, where is she? Ann and I, we are low-budget travelers. And a few years back, we took our kids to visit Carlsbad Caverns as part of a cross-country adventure. Well, the only accommodations near the park were out of our price range. But we had heard that it's illegal to camp on land that's owned by the Bureau of Land Management. And our AAA map showed this huge expanse of desert right across the highway from the park, marked BLM. So it was perfect. We were all set. So we drove out this rugged dirt track and pitched our tent on the dusty desert hardpan there. And we made and ate supper. But before going to bed, I realized that I would need to use the restroom. Number 2. Well, the closest restroom was over the horizon from where we were camping. We are veteran campers, enough to know that here in the eastern woodlands, it's proper to bury one's bodily waste at least 6 inches deep. But in the high desert out there, proper disposal involves leaving it to dry in the sun. So I strolled, and some of you know where this is going, I can tell. I strolled a little way away from our campsite and did my business while marveling at the crystal clear desert star field above my head. Now, at this point, you may be thinking that this story involves a painful encounter with a cactus. But no, there were plenty of prickly plants around, but this story's magic begins the next morning. As we packed up in the bright morning sun, we saw something that you cannot see here in the northeastern states. At different times, 4 large black beetles came through our camping area, each one rolling a dusty brown marble along the ground, following surprisingly straight trajectories that all seemed to radiate from a point some ways off. Guess what point? Well, we were mystified, so we followed their paths in reverse, and we encountered dozens of similar beetles, all racing out in all directions, from the now completely bare spot where I had squatted the night before. How did they find it? Where were they going? It was astounding and kind of unnerving. And it obviously made a lasting impression on us and on our kids. Of course, these were dung beetles. And I now know that dung beetles need those precious brown marbles to feed and nurture their own children. And often they only get one shot at it, if they get even one shot. Now, this happened long before I started thinking in earnest about science and spirituality. But it was an intimate and visceral lesson in the ways that I am connected to the world around me, especially the living world. It was a revelation of sorts, both humbling and connecting. Talk about spiritually grounding. Dung beetles probably aren't what the folks who chose this week's theme had in mind, however. And I hate to disappoint, but this isn't actually a message about dung beetles this morning. It's about finding some sort of scripture that could serve as a marriage vow in the polyamorous union of the world's many religions. And most people who consider themselves spiritual or religious have some source, some kind of sacred text that they refer to for insight and guidance. But those texts are all different, right? So we end up arguing about which one, which religion, and which interpretation is the right one. And people of goodwill do their best to reach across theological and scriptural divides. But what if there were no scriptural divides? Or in other words, what if there were a common scripture that was shared by all the world's religions? You know, my coworker brought a CD version of the Holy Scripture to work the other day, and he got upset when I asked if I could burn a copy of it. Yeah. There's nothing like a good joke, and that was nothing like a good joke. But it brings up an important point about what we mean by a Holy Scripture or a sacred text. Pagan priestess Starhawk once wrote that something is sacred when there is no end, no goal that would justify its destruction or desecration. And if you like that approach, it suggests that sacred texts describe things or ideas that must be protected, revered, cherished. Sacred texts describe things or ideas that must be protected, revered, cherished. Hold that thought, because we'll come back to it. Has anyone here heard a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text? Anyone exposed to that? Yeah, awesome. Well, a Harvard Divinity student named Vanessa Zoltan began studying the classic fiction work Jane Eyre as though it were a sacred scripture, just to see if she could glean some spiritual meaning from it. And she and her professor were astounded at how beneficial that process was. So the effort grew into a study group using the Harry Potter books as though they were sacred texts. And this continued to grow. It actually got out of hand for them. And it became a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Now, 9 years later, 16 million people have benefited spiritually from studying the Harry Potter books as though they were scripture. And that's in spite of J.K. Rowling's dismaying transphobia and anti-Semitism. Their point is not that Harry Potter is a sacred text. It isn't. They chose it because it's well known and there's a whole lot going on in the story's plot. I mention this because I think if this can work with Harry Potter, of all things, it could work with almost any text. And what they're doing in this podcast is called exegesis, which means interpretation of a text, usually sacred texts. And Vanessa and her team say, in big, bold type on their website, "We believe that in treating texts as sacred, we can learn to treat one another as sacred." Let me say that again. We believe that in treating texts as sacred, we can learn to treat one another as sacred. And they emphasize that this works. With Harry Potter, it works because of three things: trust, rigor, and community. Trust that the text can yield generous rewards. Rigor, well, here's how they put it. They say the text in and of itself is not sacred, but it is made so through our rigorous engagement with it. And then community, in that it takes a village to be uplifted together, to make holy meaningfulness from a text that's studied in community. Now, monks and theologians have been doing this for millennia, studying their sacred texts with trust that it's worth the effort, rigorous engagement with the text and with one another, and of course, in religious community. And I think if millions of people can extract spiritual enrichment from studying the Harry Potter books, then if we had a global text that we all regarded as sacred, what miracles could arise from interfaith dialogue on that text, especially if we studied it with trust, rigor, and in community? I think the world might be very different. If we had a common scripture, different people would probably make different meanings from it. That's okay. As you know, the billions of people who study the Hebrew book of Genesis have all kinds of different takes on the role of women, for example. All right, I can't resist. What did God say after creating Adam? She said, I can do better than that. What's not funny is how some in this country's history used the text of Genesis to justify slavery. And then later, some used Darwin's Origin of Species to justify eugenics. Catholics and Protestants read the same Bible, but obviously don't take identical meanings from it. So clearly the same text can yield different interpretations. So a common scripture doesn't necessarily prevent misuse of it, doesn't guarantee religious reconciliation, but it might help, I think. At the very least, we could have some shared holidays, and we'd have some common language for addressing challenges, from personal challenges to global crises. At heart, religious scriptures are about spiritual experience. So play with me for a moment. Just take a moment to close your eyes and remember a time when you felt profoundly spiritually inspired, or totally at peace, or deeply connected in some way. Take a few deep breaths and put yourself back there. Remember where you were and how it felt. Relive it as well as you can. And when you feel like you have it in good memory, open your eyes and take another deep breath. Anyone care to share briefly what they experienced? Yeah, go ahead. And I'll repeat what you said.
I used to lead my trip. This was a trip that I was taking with a bunch of teenagers, and we were in France, and we were going down the street that had cottage trees on both sides, and all our wheels seemed to be going.
So on a bike trip in France with teenagers, a street lined with poplar trees, and you just felt completely, like even the wheels of the bicycles were completely aligned, completely like one thing moving together. Beautiful. Any others? Yeah, go ahead. So traveling with family in the Alps on a day when the sun and the clouds were just perfect and the gorgeousness of the mountains came and went. Say it again.
It was mystical.
It felt mystical.
Misty and mystical.
Misty and mystical, yeah. When I ask people to share about their spiritual experiences, almost always they describe something that happened in a natural setting, or an experience that was deeply connective, or both, connective experiences in nature. And here's the big reveal. We do have a common global scripture, and you've been living and worshiping in its pages your whole life, perhaps never considering its spiritual potential, its sacred depths, if you will. It is tremendously rich in theological content. We might disagree about the divine provenance of one another's traditional scriptures, but this one we know to have been directly written into existence by the forces that got the universe started, however we perceive and name that ultimate source. Our common scripture is nature, creation, natural reality. A vast cosmos we now know to be at least 13 billion years old and 47 billion light years across. This isn't a new idea. Thomas Berry, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Ursula Goodenough, and many others have offered that natural reality could serve us as a kind of religious scripture. Berry called it the book of the universe and the great book of nature. And he urged that natural reality could supplement existing religious scriptures. Like with Harry Potter and the sacred text, I'm eager to study nature in interfaith communities with trust that it will bring inspiration and rigor to get the science right. For example, did you know that there are more solar systems in the visible universe than there are grains of sand on the earth? Think about all the beaches, all the deserts. Let that sink in. Our telescopes can see more solar systems than there are grains of sand on this planet. Our ancestors couldn't know this. We didn't have a good estimate of the number of galaxies out there until the Hubble Space Telescope captured the first deep field image in 2004. I'm looking around. I think all of us were born then. Recent. Nature's scripture is too big, too glorious to fit in any book. And it's more like an entire library of books. And science reveals whole new rooms every year, new wings every few decades. Imagine if your own holy scripture, whatever that might be, contained a sentence like this: the sun is a fire bigger than 1,000,000 earths, and there are more suns in the heavens than grains of sand on earth. What meaning would you make of that as you studied it? How does it feel to contemplate that? Does it expand your perception about the source of such a vast cosmos? Now imagine that sentence isn't a sentence in a book recorded by a revered prophet long ago, but a present-day reality you can see with your own eyes. Imagine that anyone can see it and engage with you about what it means to them, how they feel knowing this. How do you feel knowing this? Take a minute and just talk with the people around you. Just a minute, because I don't want to run over. How do you feel? What does that bring up for you? Go ahead. Good, thank you. When I ask that question in my workshops, I most often hear three sentiments. People feel awe, they feel connected with it all, or they feel really small. Now, if you followed the recent research on the experience of awe, you know that those responses are all the same. Awe makes us feel both small and more connected. So awe is a big part of what we might learn from this. And often in nature there's a counterbalance, and that's true here too. As far as we know, the only complex life in the entire universe is here on Earth. 2 trillion galaxies of stars, and this tiny dot of a planet may have the only eyes, the only hearts, the only love, the only minds to appreciate all of it. So am I a minuscule speck in a vast cosmos? Or am I precious beyond measure? Well, science just describes. And in that regard, it's a text. It doesn't tell us what it means, what to make of it. Science concerns itself with what is. It's up to each of us to determine what it means. And human beings are hardwired for making meaning. We can't even avoid it. We think in metaphors and analogies. And when we're doing science, it's really important that we stick as closely as possible to the raw facts. And it's important not to confuse our models and metaphors with reality itself. But make no mistake, meaning will be made from new knowledge, one way or another. And I think that when scientists and science writers insist that the cosmos is devoid of meaning, they may be right, but at best they leave a void that will get filled with something like Bigfoot and flat Earth and, And at worst, I think they encourage people to reject science altogether because our guts tell us that nothing is completely meaningless. I think a vast, empty cosmos means I am both minuscule and precious. I've spent many years now collecting and cataloging awe-inspiring wonders of natural reality that are meaningful to me. I call them revelations because they get revealed as scientists do their work. And even if we had 1,000 hours this morning, I could barely scratch the surface of them all. And when I meditate on science revelations like this and interpret them like the passages of a religious text, some consistent threads of meaning stand out for me. I see patterns that have meaning not only for me personally, but that offer, I think, to help heal a wounded society on a critically ill planet. I call those the insights. So we have revelations that offer insights. And I want to skim through just 3 of the insights: unity, cooperation, and diversity. First, let me say that what I'm about to share is partly science and partly exegesis. It's interpretive meaning-making from the findings of science. Someone else might look at the same science knowledge and interpret it differently. So as we go along, I invite you to keep the week's theme in mind: spiritually grounding, inclusively affirming. Speaking of spiritually grounding, let's take a few breaths together. In on 3, 2, 1, and out on 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's good. The breath of life. Let's do it again. In on 3, 2, 1. Out on 3, 2, 1. Beautiful. Did you know that the word spirit is Latin for breath? When we die, our spirit, our breath, leaves us. Unity of breath. Play along with me for a minute. Bring to mind a prophet or teacher or a famous person at the root of your faith tradition. Someone from long ago, like, I don't know, Moses, Confucius, Buddha, someone like that. Someone you consider central to what you regard as profound or sacred. Everybody got someone in mind? Yeah? Okay. Now, take another deep breath with me. You just breathed in over 13 sextillion air molecules in one breath. But here's the thing. Over 700 million of those molecules were also, at some point, inside the lungs of the prophet or teacher you were thinking of. We know that every breath contains millions of molecules from everyone who lived more than a few decades ago, and a few from almost everyone alive today. The air we breathe is the breath of our ancestors, right here with us, taken into our bodies with every breath. That same breath includes a few air molecules from every animal that ever lived, and every plant that ever lived. They're all, in a way, right here in the air we share this morning. You are breathing in molecules that moments ago were a blade of grass on the lawn, were the person next to you, a seagull soaring out over the lake. Some of the oxygen molecules you breathed in a moment ago now are you. Millions of them have been incorporated into your body, and they have come alive by being part of your living body. Holding all of that in your awareness, take another breath with me. Does it feel any different? Maybe a little? Unity of water. There are more solar systems than grains of sand on Earth, and there are more water molecules in 1 tablespoon of water than all the stars and sand grains combined. There are more water molecules in every tablespoon of water than all the stars in the universe and grains of sand on Earth combined. Air and water molecules are so small and so numerous, and they cycle around the Earth so constantly that every cup of beverage you swallow contains over 150 million molecules that actually passed through Jesus' body during his lifetime. If your prophet or teacher lived longer than Jesus, or about 35 years, then it's even more than 150 million in every cup. And if you will allow me to abbreviate those molecules that have passed through prophets and teachers as holy molecules, then the average human body contains about 180 million holy molecules per pound. So if you weigh 100 pounds, that's more than 18 billion holy molecules that were once living as Jesus or other prophets, and a similar number for every other prophet. And they're all inside you as you right now, as we sit here this morning. Every drop of water contains molecular emissaries from all the oceans of the world, from all of our ancestors, from every living thing that ever lived. That's the science. Now, what does it mean for you? Take a couple minutes to share with someone near you. And do this. It'll be fun. I promise. I do promise. It'll be fun. Talk to someone around you. How does it feel? What does it mean for you that this comes from everywhere? Well, you're doing it. You're studying what science reveals about nature as a form of scripture, and you're doing exegesis on physical reality. To me, what arises for this is a couple things. One, connectedness. I am connected to all those other things that use water out there. But also that all water is, in a way, holy. Each breath is holy. It means I am intimately connected with all life on earth, past and future. Made one, in a way, with all living beings throughout or through the communion of holy water, the breath of life, the flow of time. Holiness infuses every breath and every sip, every moment I'm alive. For me, it's tremendously grounding and connective, knowing this. Family unity. The same kind of genetic testing being done routinely now allows us to trace gene variants and point mutations back through the generations, similar to the way genealogists trace surnames on birth records. Except that the written record of genetics, the scripture, if you will, doesn't get destroyed in courthouse fires. It's written into every cell of your body, and it allows us to trace your ancestry as far back as we choose to go. And genetic studies now make it clear that every human being on the planet is a distant cousin, connected to one another by our human ancestors in Eastern Africa about 200,000 years ago. So look around at the other people here. These are your cousins. Gosh, it's like a spontaneous family reunion. So how do we greet a cousin we've never met before that shows up at a family reunion? Let's practice. Right, exactly. Turn to someone near you you don't already know and say, "Hello, cousin. I'm so glad to finally meet you." I promise it'll be fun. Nicely done. You know, if you do this with strangers on the street, you can take their confused looks as an invitation to share your enthusiasm about having a close-knit family of 8 billion. Of course, my cousins don't only include people who are easy to know and get along with. Right? I'm also talking about the grubby panhandler I pretended not to see yesterday, and the driver who cut me off on the road and then gave me the finger. My human family includes people who are so different I'm repulsed by them and their behavior. And world leaders that I regard as evil, those are my cousins too. Air and water contain molecular emissaries from all those people as well, from Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot, and from dung beetles with their vile little marbles. You know, this doesn't thrill me. It's not all sweetness and light. I don't like that the water I drink has been part of tyrants as well as teachers. Revelations are not always comfortable. And that's true of most sacred scriptures, right? Discomfort is part of the spiritual journey. Our choice is to face the truth of our unity, all of it, or to live in a superficial denial of reality. I don't think we can be spiritually grounded without also being inclusively affirming, because reality affirms it. There's only one family of human beings on this planet, and it includes all of us. And every family has oddballs, right? And addicts, wounded people, conflicts, and some measure of abuse and neglect. But if we're spiritually grounded, the love of family can be bigger than all of that. Most of us find ways to love our family members, even when they change their pronouns, or marry someone we dislike, or convert to some other religion, or don't want to talk to us for a while. All humans are cousins. Every conflict is a family conflict. Every war is a civil war. Recognizing this, for me, has been profound. I'd sure like to share it with Hamas and Netanyahu. And our deep kinship doesn't stop with people. Those same genetic tests and many other lines of evidence allow us to trace our ancestry back to our primate forebears and beyond, revealing that every living thing on this planet is blood-related, even the ones with nothing like blood in their bodies. 99.9% of my DNA is exactly the same as yours. 80% same as a cow. Mice, 70%. Bananas, 50%. Every morning, I eat a distant cousin for breakfast. What can I say? They're delicious. The tree of life is a family tree with branches for every living thing on the planet. And this is not just someone's conjecture. There's overwhelming evidence that this is a fact. And we can actually map out precise relationships based on genetic variations. So we humans are neither the root nor the apex of that family tree. We're just one leaflet on one small branch of a huge and ancient tree. That's the science. Now, what meaning are we going to make from it? How will we treat all our relations? Genetics and molecular cycles on the earth, these are only 2 data points among thousands that define a theme of unity in natural reality. And in other talks, I cover evidence from cosmology and astronomy, because unity is written all over those fields too. Unity is built into reality at all scales, suggesting that the forces that created all this have a penchant for unity and interrelation. Another insight. Cooperation. When I was a child, my brother is here today, which thrills me no end. When I was a child, my parents were Shackley distributors. Shackley, if you don't know, is a personal marketing thing like Avon or Amway. But this meant that for us kids, a treat was a Shackley energy bar. Believe me, they were nothing like candy. And one day I noticed that a colony of ants had chewed a hole in the wrapper of an energy bar that had fallen unnoticed under one of the radiators. And to their credit, my parents treated it as a science project and let the ants eat. And those ants were fascinating to me. I spent hours on my belly watching them day after day. I noticed how they walked in parallel lines, almost like highways, complete with passing lanes, and how they touched antennae with each other as they passed. Well, within about a month, the ants had completely carried off that energy bar, one tiny mouthful at a time. Why am I telling you this? Well, survival of the fittest does not mean survival of the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. The fittest means those whose bodies and behaviors are best aligned with the demands of their environment. Environments change, so fittest means different things in different times, in different places. And in the 4 billion years of life on this planet, survival of the fittest has most often meant survival of the most cooperative. There is competition between individuals and between species, but survival is often a team sport. So cooperators almost always have an advantage. Those worker ants carrying tiny bits of energy bar back to the nest were sterile. They had no chance of having baby ants of their own. They were working to support their sisters and nieces who could and would have offspring. Cooperation is the essence of every major advance in the complexity of life on Earth. So in the eukaryotic revolution, single-celled bacteria engulfed but didn't digest their neighbors to the benefit of both. And those internal cooperators became essential organelles of our cells, like mitochondria and the chloroplasts in plant cells. Then later, single complex cells like that cooperated to make the first multicellular organisms. Up until then, there were no organs, no blood, no stomachs, no brains. Cooperation between cells allowed them to specialize into tissues and organs. And much later, some of those multicellular creatures cooperated in societies, like ants and elephants, and of course people. The fossil record consistently reflects greater and greater scales of cooperation, building up layers of biological complexity, from simple cells to more complex ones, to multicellular organisms, to societies of organisms that function in ever larger confederations. And I haven't even started on interspecies cooperation like you see between remora fish and sharks. So cooperation happens so often and so consistently in natural reality that it shows up everywhere in the biosphere. And all of that only happens if there's diversity. No evolutionary change can happen in a population if its members are all clones of each other. Diversity gives natural selection something to work with. It's important to mention here that natural selection works on populations, not individuals. So, for example, dandelions grow to various heights. In a mowed lawn, the short ones have an advantage. In a wild meadow, the tall ones get more sunlight. So it's not that some individuals are better than others. It's that diverse populations have more survival options, like a football team that knows more plays, or a musical group with a larger repertoire. And this is true of cultural evolution too. If we all spoke the same language, worshiped the same gods, ate the same foods, we would all be far less adaptable as the world changes around us. So diversity is a prerequisite for resilience. Cooperation and diversity are winning strategies in evolution. That's the science. What does it mean for us today? As you know, there are dogmatic movements afoot in both politics and religion that actually oppose diversity. Diversity of thought, of culture, of language, of our various names for the ultimate. This happens at both extremes of the political and cultural spectrum. I think that way myself too often. But how fragile I would be if my muscle cells started a movement to convert or kill all those inflexible, boneheaded bone cells, right? I'd be a mess if they succeeded. If we want to survive, I think evolution suggests we have to find ways to cooperate within and across our diversity, just like my cells and tissues and organs do. Diversity provides our grandchildren with options as they face a changing environment. And boy, are they facing a changing environment. Once again, it seems like the source of this universe has a thing for cooperation within diversity. And here again, it plays out in the diversity of galaxies and stars and all kinds of other fields of science. I invite you to check out my website if you'd like to know more about that. Science is limited to the study of natural reality. So science is necessarily agnostic about anything religious or supernatural. But scientists are Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, Shintoists, Jews, Jains, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, heathens, Confucians, animists, Confucians, not Confucians, pagans. Name any religious tradition, and there are almost certainly research scientists who practice that faith, along with colleagues of no religious faith. More than nations or religious organizations or other NGOs, more than really any other human endeavor, science is people from every culture and nation and faith working together to reveal the secrets of creation, if you will. Science is a book of secrets, a grand scripture of nature. Because science is effectively an interfaith endeavor, it's perfectly situated to offer its findings for the enrichment of every flavor of spirituality, and to do so in interfaith spaces. The findings of science are 100% about the handiwork of whatever forces created all this. With all our religious diversity, we meet and engage one another in this world. However we might disagree about transcendent realities, we generally agree the earth is round, right? That DNA sequences guide the development of our bodies. That microscopic pathogens cause infectious diseases. That devices based on quantum effects in tiny transistors work, right? It's true that sometimes new discoveries force us to reconsider our beliefs in a new and more expansive light. That's a spiritual practice too. We did it after Galileo, and we can do it today too. I'm eager to know, how does the kinship of all living things resonate, similarly or differently, for Hindus and Muslims, for Jews and Taoists, for Jains and Christians, for Mormons and pagans and atheists? What could they learn from one another once they go a little deeper than polite appreciation for one another's beliefs and rituals? The fact of our kinship is something we all share because we are it. We are that kinship. I think it's a really solid ground for supporting deep and authentic interfaith dialogue. And of course, kinship is just one book in nature's immense scriptural library. The culture wars urge us to think of science as some kind of enemy of religion and spirituality, claiming that science reduces all magic and mystery to the mundane mud of materialism. I gotta tell you, science does just the opposite for me. The universe we explore today is 100 quadrillion times as large as the one Galileo got in trouble for. And his version was millions of times larger than the universe theologians believed in at the time. Science makes God bigger. Relativity and quantum mechanics now reveal a luminous, numinous, material reality that contains no actual material. Every discovery, every dark frontier illuminated, reveals even greater mysteries beyond the shores of our knowledge. And with each new revelation, nature's glory and elusiveness grow, often by leaps and bounds. And in me, this inspires an ever-expanding awe of the creative forces that birthed all this, however that happened. I like to say, science is awesome, but it's nature that's awesome. Science just reveals it to us. Science offers revelations that could serve as a global interfaith scripture on the handiwork of ultimate source. Nature's scripture is the only literal common ground we have. And here we are, living in it, living as it. We can perform exegesis on physical reality. Studied with trust, rigor, and an interfaith community, nature offers to be, if not the wedding vows in the civil marriage of the world's religions, then maybe the officiant that beckons them to the altar, that says, "Come, all are welcome." When something is sacred, nothing can justify its destruction or desecration. The text, in and of itself, is not sacred, but is made so through our rigorous engagement with it. We believe that in treating texts as sacred, we can learn to treat one another as sacred. Nature is a sacred text. And sacred texts describe things that must be protected, revered, cherished. Approached with trust that studying nature can yield spiritual rewards, rigorous, earnest engagement to make it sacred, and in community, global interfaith community, natural reality as science reveals it to us could unite the world's religions in holy testimony. When we treat nature as sacred, knowing that our bodies are one with the whole of creation, we might just come to treat one another as sacred too. Sacred elements of a sacred planet, minuscule and precious in a vast and glorious cosmos. May it be so. Thank you for coming this morning. This has been really fun for me. And we do have some time for questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, J.D. It was wonderful. If you do have a question, please come to the microphone over here, and J.D. will do his best to answer it.
Your sense of interconnection and cooperation really resonated, and it reminded me of braiding sweetgrass, which I don't know if you could comment on both the scientist who wrote that and the Native American interconnected philosophy that drove some of the book, which was all about interconnections and cooperation.
Raise your hand if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Ann and I are about 3/4 through, and almost every page I'm going, wow, yeah. Science, with its very logical either-or sort of binary logic, has brought us to the point where we now recognize that physical reality is not binary and not necessarily logical, and it takes us, I almost said back, but it takes us forward to a really strong resonance with what indigenous peoples have always just assumed. The interconnectedness, the interrelatedness, and the sacredness of everything that exists. And as Ken mentioned, Robin Wall Kimmerer is both a plant, she's a botanist, so she understands all the molecular, the homeostatic mechanisms of plant cells and how they work, but she also comes out of the Potawatomi native tradition, which treats plants as relatives, not as resources. That's one of my favorite sayings lately. Another indigenous scientist, Daniel Wildcat, said, "We live among relatives, not resources." And our culture tends to treat everything as a resource. And if we're going to survive, I think Braiding Sweetgrass is a book that will help us get to a place where we can have more reverence and less rapaciousness in our relations with the world around us.
not wanting to speak as if UUs have any sort of, I don't know what, but my hunch is that we would be more open to this concept. So if we're talking to people who are sort of much more rigid in their beliefs, right or wrong, how do you engage them? How do you pull them in when in fact they probably don't think science has anything to do with their life?
That is a great question, and I wish I had a great answer. I think it's part of who we are as humans that we crave certainty. We like answers. And as many answers as the universe provides, it offers even more questions. And that's foundational in the UU tradition. I mean, people always say UUs are people who like questions more than they like answers. My spouse has been encouraging me to take the plunge and give talks like this one in much more conservative Christian spaces. And until recently, I have been reluctant to do that. But I am starting to find points of common ground where maybe we can begin with that. And one of those is the beginning of time. I didn't mention that here, but one of the cosmological things is Einstein showed us that time and space are actually the same thing, space-time. And that time had a beginning. And that, talk about a revelation, time had a beginning. So when we ask questions like, what caused the beginning of time? Well, cause and effect require time. So the question, what happened before time began, is a Zen koan. It's like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You can't even engage really deeply with the question, what happened before time began? And so that probably permanent mystery is the common ground between biblical literalists and people who are eager to incorporate natural reality into their spirituality. And we'll see how it goes.
One more. Two things. First, if you enjoyed this, I wanted to put in a plug for our friend Chris Miller, who leads Church of the Wild at 4 p.m. on Sundays. It's in the weekly program, so if you enjoy this, you might enjoy that too, an opportunity to commune with nature here at Chautauqua. And then my question is, you use the term exegesis a number of times. Can you just give a little more definition and description about what that means?
It's just interpretation. So when a bunch of Christians sit down to do Bible study and they read a passage and they talk about what it means, that's exegesis. It's just a fancy word for interpretation.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to publicly thank you for an inspiring morning. This was a good start to mine. And I also want to suggest that maybe find a conservative ally in the church or in a faith-based tradition who can provide entree, and that might help.
Yeah, people that other people trust. That's a great idea. I'll remember that.
And then, if I may, I'd just like to share something personal. My husband is a news junkie. Although we have a room in our house now, I will not watch anything political after 8 o'clock. And it's becoming earlier because I want to sleep. He also has a good sense of humor, and he's been sharing a lot of these political humor pieces, including some funny haikus about some of the weird things going on in politics. So there have been various haiku contests recently, and about a month or so ago, something popped into my head overnight, and then one I just wrote it down, and I'd like to share it. And you all know haiku is 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables, unless you don't follow rules. So, if I can remember. Why divisions among us. Black, white, red, blue. We are all stardust.
Beautiful, yeah.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to remind you the fourth and last lecture in the Cultural Ethics series will take place on August 7th right here at 12:30 in the middle of the day, not at 9:30. And the speaker will be Professor Chris Cameron. Chris is Professor of History at the University of North Carolina. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and African American religious and intellectual history. He's a really interesting guy, and his topic will be African American secular humanists, what we believe. So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful day.
Please take one of my cards from the table.